Hello and welcome back to the Sinobabble podcast. We have a lot to get through today, so I'm just going to run through the preamble very quickly so that we can get to the content. Follow me on Substack. The most recent article was about the potential for World War III to break out in the South China Sea. Also follow me on Buy Me a Coffee if you want to support the podcast. You get full transcripts of every single episode. You also get extra videos, and occasionally we will do a live stream as well once I've got all my stuff sorted out. Follow me on social media. All the links are down below. Right, let's get into what we're going to talk about today. So on March 19th, Hong Kong passed Article 23 of the Basic Law of Hong Kong. This is Hong Kong's new national security legislation. It follows up on legislation that was introduced in 2020, and it governs 5 different areas of criminality: treason, insurrection, theft of state secrets and espionage, sabotage endangering national security, and external interference. So the national security legislation that was introduced in 2020 was both a reaction to and a catalyst for massive protests that took place across the island. But Article 23 is different because it's actually part of Hong Kong's basic law, so its mini constitution, as opposed to being a sort of externally imposed part of the one country, two systems mechanism. So it's essentially supposed to plug gaps that the national security law from mainland China cannot plug. This is not the first time that Article 23 has been put through the ringer, so to speak. In 2003, the Legislative Council of Hong Kong tried to put the bill through Parliament one time, but guess what? It was met with widespread protest, and they've been trying on and off ever since and never been able to get it through. However, since China has become more, shall we say, involved in Hong Kong, there have been protests that have been fully quashed. Any opposition to either Beijing or the pro-Beijing side of Hong Kong's government has been done away with. Any rights activists have been silenced or have had to flee the country. And the population that may have been a bit more skeptical of China's imposition on Hong Kong have been silenced because of increased police security. Then this time it just passed. no consultation. There was only a 2-week consultation period and no objections as well. Everybody said yes in the parliament. So yippee for Article 23. Before I jump into exactly what it says in the article, I want to go back in time a little bit. We're going to go all the way back to 2019, and we're going to discuss the protests and all the other legislative stuff that took place in that glorious period. And we're going to talk about how we basically got to the point where Article 23 was able to be passed without any objections, when before it was persona non grata. So I have a lot of Substack posts and also a whole podcast mini-series about the protests in Hong Kong, which you can go back and listen to if you're interested. They're from when I used to live in Hong Kong, so they've got interviews with protesters as well and sort of more on-the-ground reporting. But this is going to be a quick whistle-stop tour. So yeah, let's just get into it. So the first set of protests took place in 2019 over what is now known as the extradition law. So the point of the extradition law was essentially to bring Hong Kong under the same legal jurisdiction as China when it came to those who had committed crimes in China or against China. There's a lot more to it than that. There's lots and lots of detail to it. But essentially what people were worried about was that it was violating the one country, two systems and the basic law of Hong Kong, which basically grants Hong Kong semi-independent status until full reunification in 2047. The protest started as peaceful marches of over 2 million people and slowly escalated into violent clashes between the police and protesters, the taking over of university campuses by students, and eventually the storming of the LegCo by a breakaway group, which some people argue also included sort of like mainland plants who were trying to sabotage the protest, but it doesn't really matter now because it's all over. Eventually, the extradition bill was withdrawn from Parliament in October of 2019, but that did not stop the troubles for the protesters. Other things that they asked for example, Carrie Lam stepping down from office, they did not get. And in general, the security situation in Hong Kong had been really heightened. The police, who used to have a really good reputation in Hong Kong, their reputation was in tatters and they didn't seem to care. They were taking extra measures, especially with young people, especially if young men were wearing black, sort of stopping and searching people at random, breaking up any large groups. There was just like a general atmosphere of like, you know, heightened suspense at basically all times. There was a lot of back and forth during this period. People weren't really sure if the protests were going to continue or not. Essentially, the problem had been solved, and then COVID broke out at the beginning of 2020. So the mass protesting side of things came to a halt pretty quickly. However, things came to a head once again when in 2020, the government announced that they were going to enact a new bill, which was the National Security Bill. So this was sort of framed as a response to the violence of the previous year. If you don't know anything about the law, it essentially criminalizes secession, subversion of the central government, terrorism, and interference from outside parties or governments in China's internal affairs. So protests erupted immediately, regardless of COVID. And a fight actually broke out in the LegCo, where the pro-Beijing clique was like trying to take the floor from the pro-democracy clique, and people were dragged out by security. Like, it was very dramatic. I think at one point someone threw a potted plant at someone. I may be mixing up my acts of defiance here, but needless to say, things got very heated and the tensions were running very high. It's at this point that things started spiraling completely out of control. So Carrie Lam suspended the parliamentary elections, ostensibly because of the pandemic, but really I think because the pro-Beijing party were not sure that they would be able to win a majority, which they absolutely had to do if they were going to get the National Security Bill passed. Prominent activists known as the Hong Kong 12 tried to flee for Taiwan by speedboat and were detained without being able to see anyone. The pro-China counter-protesters started beating up people in MTR stations, textbooks, statues, shops, merch, anything that alluded to the protests or any sort of anti-China sentiment, anything bad that had happened in Chinese history were all banned and all shut down. People started applying for their BNOs, which is like the right to live in the UK, before the deadline, and around 90,000 people in total left the country. Carrie Lam stepped down for somebody even less likable, if that was even possible. And all of this is happening as COVID is going on. So needless to say that it was a crazy 2 years for the protesters, and it did not end well for them. The failure of the protests and the eventual introduction of the national security law is what paved the way for Article 23 to be introduced. What the national security law did was allow the mainland Chinese government, through the mechanism of Hong Kong police, Hong Kong legislature and things like that, to slowly do away with any dissident voices and any potential resistance or opposition to pro-Beijing sentiment in Hong Kong. Any sort of effective opposition was forcibly or gradually removed. Rights activists, NGOs, all of these people were sort of silenced, or their voices were marginalized, minimized, and pushed to the side. We have some really big examples. For example, there's the arresting and fleeing of high-profile dissidents such as Nathan Law from Hong Kong, and the Hong Kong government offering bounties up to $1 million Hong Kong dollars for information about their whereabouts. So that shows you just how important it is for the Chinese government to silence these people and their voices. Newsrooms across Hong Kong, sort of independent media, were raided. Several newspapers, such as the Stand News, were forced to shut down completely, and freedom of press in Hong Kong basically fell off a cliff. Teenagers as young as 14, 15, 16 were arrested for subversion and inciting secession, which is like... And I think the biggest piece of news to come out of it is the trial of a man called Jimmy Lai. Jimmy Lai is like a media tycoon in Hong Kong. He owned the newspaper The Apple Daily, and that was sort of like the last bastion of free speech in the Chinese language, in Cantonese, in Hong Kong. His trial is equivalent to like the trial of the century in Hong Kong. Like, if he goes down, it is like completely over. He's being charged with conspiracy to collude with foreign forces and conspiring to publish seditious publications. The government has also been able to silence what may have been legitimate political opposition to these articles being introduced as well. So generally speaking, in the Hong Kong legislature, you have like the pro-democracy, as they're sort of known, camp, and the pro-Beijing camp. It's an oversimplification, but it works for what we're kind of talking about right now. What the legislature did after the national security law was introduce a new bill or a new sort of requirement that anybody who stands for lawmaker, so stands for like the highest office in the LegCo, has to pass a patriotism test before taking office. So basically they have to pledge their allegiance to mainland China, which not everybody was comfortable with doing. I'm sure you can guess who those people were. Just in case the pro-democracy camp wasn't deflated enough, however, the government went a step further in 2021 by arresting 47 pro-democracy campaigners for holding what they termed to be illegal primaries and charging them with conspiracy to commit subversion under the national security law. So what they did was they basically set up mini primaries in different districts so that they could make sure that the most popular candidate for that district in the pro-democracy camp was the one that they would put forward, right? So like a regular primary like you have in like the US as well. But these were deemed illegal. They were told that you're only doing this so that you can get the majority and therefore veto bills, which is like, yes, that's the whole point of parliament. But, you know, this was all heightened, sort of ridiculous lengths. Like, you know, you're trying to make the executive of Hong Kong step down. You're trying to shut down the government. And so a lot of these people were detained. I think the majority of them are now held without bail for trial. They've been held for like over 2 years. Some of them have agreed to testify against the other ones, which I guess is just how it goes. Not everybody can go to prison for life. Some people have families. But yeah, it just shows how the introduction of the national security law was a key moment in sort of eroding any possibility of really standing up to whatever the Chinese government would want to impose upon Hong Kong from that point forwards. So yeah, basically China's been taking the piss since they introduced the national security law. So now I want to sort of, you know, following on from that, discuss what Article 23 sort of adds to the national security law. I'm going to go through it as quickly as possible. It's a long document. It's over 200 pages long. The first 20 pages are contents and like preamble and stuff, but there's still, it took me a while to read, but most of it is boring legalese. A lot of it is repetitive. So I'm just going to try and sort of pull out what I think is the most interesting or relevant for us to discuss, the things that might be considered the most controversial additions as well. I'll try and cover basically what everything says, but I want to really focus in on some of the language that's used in order to explain sort of why people are so hesitant, so resistant, and so scared about what this law could mean. One of the key objections that people have to this law is that it's like very vague, very broad, and therefore very open to interpretation. To give you a sense of that, I just want to read some of the definitions from the preamble that kind of give you an idea of what we're dealing with here. So in section 1, it gives a few definitions that you're supposed to take forward throughout the article. So the first one is the definition of national security, a reference to the status in which the state's political regime, sovereignty, unity, and territorial integrity, the welfare of the people, sustainable economic and social development, and other major interests of the state are relatively free from danger and internal or external threats, and the capability to maintain a sustained status of security. Now let's move on to the definition of colluding with external forces. A person colludes with an external force to do an act if one or more of the following circumstances exist. The person participates in an activity planned or led by an external force. The person does an act on behalf of an external force. The person does the act in cooperation with an external force. The person does the act under the control, supervision, or direction or on request by an external force, or the person does an act with financial contributions or support by other means of an external force. And then it goes on to provide this definition of an external force. The government of a foreign country, the authority of a region or place of an external place, a political party in an external place, any other organization in an external place that pursues political ends, an international organization. So the reason that I pulled out these three definitions in particular is because I feel like when you put them together and you take out the vaguest and most specious parts of them, you can really see how someone would be in danger by doing something that kind of touches upon each of these things, but with no real, like, I don't know how to put it. So like, say, like you could be getting financial support or support of other means, which is not defined, from an international or external organization, again, not defined, has to be pursuing political means, again, very vague as to what that could be, or very broad as to what that could be. And that could be interpreted as being relatively against the interests of the state and national security. That could be anything. That could be anything. Like, you could be someone chatting with an NGO about like the state of Hong Kong, or do like a podcast talking about Hong Kong, and that could be against this law. So yeah, I just wanted to give an idea here of what we're dealing with, essentially. So expect that level of like, wait a minute, all the way through here. Part 1 is just preamble and definitions like that. So let's move on to part 2, treason. So there's a lot of pretty standard stuff in here. I think every country has a pretty good idea and pretty good laws against what treason might consist of. Although, as we've seen in certain countries, to name no names, when somebody does something that the government doesn't like and exposes that they're doing something a bit naughty, that can also count as treason. But we live in a society, I guess. So there's things in there like working with foreign military, threatening to use force or violence against the state in order to like bring down the government and things like that, sentenciable to up to life in prison, blah, blah, blah. There was a whole section on drilling, which took me a really long time to figure out that they were talking about military drills. Like I said, this thing is just like full of legal speak, and I'm just not a lawyer at all. So drilling here means like practicing military drills, you know, like standing in formation, twirling guns, I guess practicing the use of firearms and things like that. So it says that anyone who provides drilling, receives drilling, hears about drilling that's being done by someone who's not in the military or the police or something like that is going to be sent right to jail. And at first I didn't really register this, but it kind of dawned on me that what they're doing with that part is kind of preventing the establishment of any sort of militia, or I suppose like counter-government force that could rise up and potentially sort of militarize against the government. Again, this is probably standard, but I thought it was interesting that that was in the treason section as opposed to the like sedition section. It seems more like, you know, seditious activities. I don't know what they're trying to do with that bit, but anyway, you can't form a militia in Hong Kong. That's not allowed. There you go. Also, with all of these acts, not just this part, it's important to note that they all have a section at the end that basically states that the law will apply not only to Hong Kong permanent residents and Chinese Hong Kongers in Hong Kong, but also those who are abroad. So this is where like the extraterritoriality of the law comes into play. This is what people were worried about with the extradition law and the national security law as well, that it would apply to people who weren't even in Hong Kong, and therefore why should I be held to Hong Kong standards? So yeah, it will be interesting to see how in the future that comes into play if, say, a Hong Konger in the UK or Canada or Australia or something like that says or does something, and how the Chinese state will take moves to respond to that action. Part 3, sedition. So this is divided into several sections. We've got insurrection, incitement to mutiny, incitement to disaffection, and acts of seditious intention, and misc. I feel like the inclusion of misc is very important here because, again, anything that can't be specifically defined is kind of like left in this kind of like broad and vague part of the law that can be kind of manipulated as and when the government needs it to be. So you've got a lot of basic stuff in there. There's a lot of focus on people who abscond from the military, who are absent without leave, punishment for people who know that you know somebody who is absent without leave, which seems a little bit harsh, but that's okay, fine. There's also a lot of focus on if you try and like convince a member of the civil service or the legco to act against the best interests of the basic law, but it's not really spelled out what those acts might be or what the best interests of the basic law are. Again, left very vague, left very much up to interpretation. The sedition bit is quite interesting because there is a line in there that goes, a person doesn't act with a seditious intention if the person does the act with the intention to bring a Chinese citizen, Hong Kong permanent resident, or person in the HKSAR into hatred, contempt, disaffection against the state established by the PRC, the authorities of Hong Kong, the legislative or judicial authority of Hong Kong, or different classes of residents in Hong Kong. So basically, if you make somebody dislike China, I don't know if I'm reading that too literally, but to me it says if you make someone dislike China, you're going to jail. Now, they do give some exceptions to this. So for example, they say that if your intention is to give an opinion on the system or point out flaws in the system, or you're pointing out other people being mean to each other and you want them to stop being mean to each other, then you would be exempt from this. I guess like the context matters. But again, what actually constitutes a seditious act is left up to interpretation. They never actually define what these seditious acts are necessarily, except for saying what they could lead to. And I'm one of those people, I don't feel like you can define something by its outcomes, like getting somebody to hate Hong Kong. And it's like, okay, but what did I do? You know, like, what did I actually do that was so wrong? And it also says that uttering a word that has seditious intention is a jailable offence, and then follows that up by saying, in proceedings for an offence, it is not necessary to prove that a person does the act or utters the word with the intention to incite any other person to do an act causing public disorder. So they're literally exempting themselves from having to prove that you did something wrong and you did that thing wrong on purpose. Again, if you say something bad about China and it makes somebody else hate China, but you weren't trying to make them hate China, you were just stating your opinion, well, that doesn't matter because you're going to jail. The MISC section is fun because that has a book burning clause, which is always nice to see. It states that a police officer may remove or obliterate any publication that has a seditious intention. And it also has a reasonable force bit, which basically says that officers can go anywhere and do anything to anyone if they feel like it, under the auspices of this article. They have another book burning section later on in the foreign collusion section, and that really spells out the type of things that they're allowed to get rid of. So any books, accounts, writings, banners, insignia, or other movable property, which that just seems really like movable property. Say goodbye to your laptop, I guess. Belonging to any prohibited organization must, on order of a magistrate, be forfeited and given to the Secretary for Security for disposal. So just a nice little Fahrenheit 451 moment for you right there. Part 4, espionage. So obviously espionage is all about the sharing of state secrets, either internally or externally, with the aim of bringing the government down. And it does have a definition of what these state secrets may be. So state secrets include internal affairs, national defense or security, foreign affairs, economic and social development, technological development, and the relationship between Hong Kong authorities and mainland authorities. So any information on that, which is basically information in general. In terms of punishments and scope and things like that, it's pretty much what you would expect. Don't share this stuff with foreign entities, foreign governments, foreign organizations. Otherwise, you will go to jail for 7 years. And again, you've got that clause where it's you can be punished for not stopping the sharing of state secrets if you knew it was going to happen, which goes against my personal beliefs that everyone should just mind their own business. But, it seems a little bit like they're trying to encourage kind of a surveillance state, right? So with little lines like that, it's getting a bit Soviet, right? It's getting a little bit East Germany, in that you're not only supposed to act correctly yourself, but you're supposed to also act kind of as an informant for the state. Because if it turns out later that your brother did something and you were in the house with him when he was doing it and you kind of knew, but you didn't say anything, you're going to go to jail too, my dude. So it's encouraging that heightened sense of vigilance against your own people. This is a very common tactic used in Soviet-like states, in communist countries and authoritarian countries in general. You have to turn the people against each other in order that your own authoritarian sort of oversight is maintained and protected in that sense. National security, if you will. There's a section that's like offences in connection with espionage, which is basically like don't go places that you're not supposed to go, either physically or via the internet or via drone or something like that. Don't obstruct people who work in public buildings from going to work, otherwise you're going to go to jail. Don't accept money from a foreign company or foreign organization and give them information, or join a foreign company or organization, even if you didn't think it would endanger national security. So this is like this is a really weird one, because it basically says that if you end up sharing something with a foreign entity that you didn't know or you didn't think would endanger national security by the broad definitions given in this article, but it turns out it did endanger national security in some way, shape, or form, that is your fault. You could join an international NGO and they could ask for like statistics or testimonials or street interviews from people in Hong Kong. You could conduct a survey, research, something legitimate, right? Something social sciencey. Provide that information to this foreign entity, because remember, economic and social information also comes under the terms of like, what is it called? State secrets. Right? So economic and social development is also part of state secrets. So if you share any information about the economic or social development of people because you've gathered that information on the ground by yourself through surveys or social sciences work, and then you share that with this NGO that you work with or that they've paid you to do this research to do, that could be considered a criminal offense. And you could go to jail for 7 years for that. This is the reason why people are so upset about the broadness of this and the way in which this could be interpreted, because I'm not even a lawyer, and I can even see that this could just be taken absolutely anywhere that people wanted to go with it because they just didn't like what you had to say. Part 5 is sabotage endangering national security. This one was pretty obvious. I don't think there was anything here that we really need to dwell on. It's like damaging public infrastructure, public property, public works like energy or like the internet or water supply and things like that. It's all very straightforward. I personally didn't see anything that could be taken completely out of context here, but if you read it and you see something where you're like, no, that's not good, let me know and we can add it to the list. Part 6, external interference. Okay, we're over halfway there now. We're almost at the finish line, guys. So this section is all about you helping an external entity damage Hong Kong in some way, whether that's damage the government or damage like the infrastructure, just like cause like, again, national security risk, as broad and vague as that may be. If you work with an external force to use violence, destroy property, cause financial loss, damage the reputation of, or cause mental injury to another person in order to get them to change a policy, influence the court system, an election, or interfere in the relationship between Hong Kong and the mainland, you are going to go to jail. And again, going back to that, if you didn't know, that's a you problem part of the whole thing. In this section, collusion with a foreign or external force includes knowing or ought to have had known that their actions would result in the external force achieving their aims or benefiting generally from their act. It also grants the enforcer of the act the power to dissolve companies that they believe have been, or like they prove, I guess, that have been colluding with foreign forces. And they also managed to slip this little bit in towards the end. If a police officer of the rank of superintendent or above reasonably believes that any non-domestic premises, so not your house, like a public place or like like a privately owned building, are kept or used by an organization or any of its members as a place for conducting any meeting or activity or a place of business, the police officer may, at the time during which the business is carried on, or at any other reasonable time, enter and inspect the non-domestic premises. This includes if a police officer has reasonable grounds to suspect that any specified evidence is in place and the delay necessary to obtain a warrant is likely to result in the loss or destruction of the evidence, or for any other reason it would not be reasonably practicable to obtain such a warrant. The police officer may exercise any of the powers referred to as subsection 2, which is basically forcible entry, in respect of the place without a warrant. And like, here we go. This is the slippery slope right here. If you think that I am conducting business with a foreign entity with no evidence and no warrant, you're just thinking it in your head, you can come to my office, take all my stuff, remove me, arrest me. We're gonna get on to like the arresting stuff in a second. But remove me and arrest me and take all of my stuff without a warrant because you have reasonable suspicion, but you have no evidence and you're trying to collect that evidence without a warrant. So basically, you're going behind the law in order to try and enforce the law, which is just crazy. I really hope so far that I've kind of spelled out all the different steps and all the different little bits and pieces here and there that are being laid out that will allow people to use this law however they see fit. The fact that terms like national security are so broadly and vaguely defined, while the enforcement powers are very specific, just goes to show in whose favor this thing is going to work, right? And we're now going to move on to part 7, which is in fact enforcement powers, which lays out exactly how the article is going to be enforced. And if your feathers were not ruffled thus far, prepare for them to be fully ruffled. You kind of have to pay close attention to what's being said in this section. So I'm going to read out just a lot of legalese right now. And then once I've sort of run through everything, we can go through and kind of discuss exactly what has been said. What I've done here is I've tried to take out relevant chunks and kind of stitch them together so that these things do not all follow on from each other in a single flow in the article, which I partly think is deliberate, but I'm not a legal scholar, so I don't know how, it could have been written very much in the proper way and I'm just like nitpicking, but I feel like for the purposes of our analysis, it's going to help if we just run all these things together so you can see exactly step by step the measures that are going to be taken to enforce this law. A police officer of the rank of chief superintendent or above, or a police officer authorized by that officer, may, by application supported by information on oath, apply to a magistrate for an extension or further extension of the period of detention of an arrested person in police custody without charge. If the magistrate hearing the application is satisfied that there are reasonable grounds to believe that an extension of the period of detention of the arrested person is justified, the magistrate may authorize the period of detention to be extended to a period not exceeding 7 days after the expiry of the first detention period. For any subsequent application, further extended, with each period not exceeding 7 days, and the period of extension also not causing the total period of detention of the arrested person to exceed 14 days. If a person is arrested for being reasonably suspected of having committed an offence endangering national security and is detained in police custody, and during detention in police custody, the person requests to consult or is consulting a particular lawyer or lawyers, the magistrate may issue a warning authorizing the police to impose the restriction that the person must not, during the person's detention, consult that particular lawyer or lawyers. The person's consultation with that lawyer will endanger national security or cause bodily harm to any person or pervert or obstruct the course of justice. However, they may choose a different lawyer. What this is saying is that you can be detained without charge. Without charge, it says there, it's big letters, without charge. You can be detained without charge for up to 14 days without being able to consult your lawyer of choice. Now, it doesn't say that you can't consult a lawyer. It just says that the court may prevent you from consulting with a particular lawyer, lawyers, or law firm if they don't like them, basically. Like, if they feel like they're going to somehow compromise national security. Basically, I feel like that's just if the lawyer's on your side. You can be detained for up to 2 weeks without being able to talk to anybody. Similarly, if we move on to the next section, if a person is investigated for being reasonably suspected of having committed an offence endangering national security, regardless of whether that person has been arrested, the magistrate may issue a warning authorizing the police officer to restrict the person's consultation with a lawyer during the period of detention within the period of 48 hours. And all of this is going to be heard within a closed court, by the way. So the fact that you are being denied access to your lawyer, even though you haven't been formally arrested or charged with any crimes for up to 2 days, which means that you can be interrogated in that time, by the way. So they can still ask you questions. You're being detained. You haven't been charged with anything, but that doesn't stop them from interrogating you, for asking you questions, for like getting as much information out of you as possible without the means to legally defend yourself, or like understand that what they're doing might not necessarily be legal in that moment. For me, this was the most important section. Like there's technically 2 more sections, but they're not that important from my perspective. Part 8 is about mechanisms for safeguarding national security. It talks about how, civil servants have to help the government uphold the national security law if they're asked to. And part 9 is like new definitions. So like replace the word security with national security and things like that. Basically explaining all the places where terms have been changed or new clauses have been added. That is all important. But I feel like section 7 is the most important part, because it does talk about how this law is allowing law enforcement in Hong Kong and the courts in Hong Kong to basically circumvent very carefully written laws that are supposed to protect people's human rights in order to uphold what they consider national security, which is basically you talking smack about China. As you can imagine, international reactions to the law have not been positive. Again, most people's reactions have been negative about the fact that the law can be left open to interpretation, right? It's just so vague and so broad, and it could encapsulate anything beyond what we could even like think up right now. Like I gave a few examples that I could think of, but honestly, I don't think I'm as creative as the Chinese state when it comes to persecuting people. A lot of people are also upset with the fact that they don't feel like there was enough due process, not a long enough consultation period. There was only like 2 weeks of consultation. It's not really clear if any of that, it probably wasn't, but it's not really clear if any sort of advice was taken on board. Like even if you were a Hong Kong person, even if you had notes, would you pass them on? I wouldn't, because then you might be, if it does pass, you're going to be persecuted under the new laws. So I would just keep it to myself. I don't know, like call me a coward, but like it doesn't seem worth it. It doesn't seem worth passing on like minor criticisms of a law, or like even legitimate like legal questions about the law. If when the law passes, you're going to be retrospectively persecuted for uttering, well, what was the thing, like uttering words against national security, even if you didn't know that those words were going to cause a national security issue, or like you just it's all just very stressful, basically. UN experts have argued that the law will unduly limit human rights and freedom in the city, as the ordinances include numerous measures that would significantly and unduly limit freedom of expression and of peaceful assembly. This isn't helped by the breadth of the law, in which the key concept of national security was broadly defined and based on vague and contestable terms, such as the welfare of the people and sustainable economic and social development. They also picked up on other things that we discussed, like the definition of like external force is way too broad and vague, an international organization or something like that. Speaking of international organizations, Amnesty International also had something to say about the security law. They called it a devastating moment for the people of Hong Kong, hundreds of thousands of whom have previously marched through the streets to demonstrate against repressive laws, including an incarnation of this one in 2003. Today, they lost another piece of their freedom. Any act of peaceful protest is now more dangerous than ever. I thought it was interesting to see that Amnesty International actually wrote to the Legislative Council and sort of gave like a 34-page response to the draft article, in which they said that the offences and changes to investigatory powers are not necessary nor proportionate for a legitimate national security need and are contrary to Hong Kong's human rights obligations. Basically, their argument is like the whole thing is a complete assault on human rights. And, who cares, because they're an external force. So that's Hong Kong's new national security law. What do you guys think about it? Do you think that Hong Kong is over now? I do. I've thought this for a while now, but I think this is really just like the final nail in the coffin for Hong Kong. I think there was a dream that was Hong Kong, and now that dream is gone from us. I'm not trying to argue that Hong Kong was some sort of utopian paradise or anything like that. Like, it had good weather, had, there was lots of fun, lots of things you could do, but it was also a highly inequitable place. Housing prices were out of control. Lots of young people couldn't find good jobs. They were working ridiculously long hours. It's hard to have a family. It's hard to retire as well. There are lots of old people who are living insecurely in their old age and having to do part-time jobs or pick up cardboard from the streets and things like that in order to make a living. You've probably seen footage of things like cage homes, and when you go to Hong Kong as well, you can actually in the past, you could take a tour of the city and see some of the temporary shelters that people build themselves. So it's not like Hong Kong was paradise, but there was a sense of freedom. People had freedom of choice, freedom of movement, not necessarily freedom to vote for who they wanted. The voting election system in Hong Kong is a bit messed up and it's very confusing. I think what the PRC is essentially promising is that we're going to take that freedom away. We're going to exchange that freedom for social security, for basic living conditions and social benefits and things like that. And there's an argument to be made that that's not necessarily a bad thing, right? Maybe they'll be able to fix the housing problem. Maybe they'll be able to get better security for old people. Maybe they'll be able to get better jobs and living conditions for young people. But someone once said that those who exchange their liberty for security deserve neither liberty nor security. And that's something that I think about a lot these days. There's always a trade-off to be had. And I think here the trade-off is pretty clear. And I think going forward, people all over the world are going to have to think a little bit more deeply about what they are willing to trade and in order to gain something, right? Whether that be security or, more money, more food, safety for their children, whatever it is, just that awareness that there is always a trade-off. And it may seem like both ends of the agreement are in your favor in the first half, very much if you've done nothing wrong, you've got nothing to hide. But as we've seen multiple times in the past, even if you began your story on the right side of history, that doesn't necessarily mean that that's where you will end it. But, maybe I'm just coming from a position of privilege and, over academic analysis on this. I'm sure there are plenty of people in Hong Kong who are very happy with what's going on, or they're at least willing to live under those conditions as long as it means no more protests, no more disruptions to daily life. They can just get on with things because that's what the majority of people want most of the time. It remains to be seen what will become of Hong Kong. And I'll certainly be following it very closely over the next few years. And yeah, I hope you come along with me on that journey. But that is it for today, guys. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did, please like it, subscribe, share, comment, etc. on whatever platform that you are consuming this on. Again, follow me on social media. All the links should be in the description. If you'd like to support the channel, head over to Buy Me a Coffee, where you can become a subscriber, and also read the Substack newsletter because it's good. That's it for this week, guys. I hope to see you again in the next one.